Welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar or public workshop. My name is Matthew. I'm an academic track instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star. The Temple of the Silver Star is a modern mystery school. We are descendants of the Golden Dawn, and we are a Thelemic mystery school, and we offer both an academic and an initiatory track that both offer training in the mystical and magical practices of Thelema. At the end of today at the workshop, I'll give you some contact information if you'd like to learn more about us or get in touch with us. I'll give you my contact information as well. All right, so today this will be workshop full day kind of workshop here. What we'll do is 2 hours, and then we'll take a break for an hour, and then come back for another 2 hours. So that'll be 10 to noon Pacific time, and then a break from noon to 1 Pacific, and then we'll come back from 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific. If you're watching this on YouTube, by the time this first part goes up, the second part should already be up, and I'll create a playlist with both of those videos. So I did a class series, a webinar series back in, I think, February or March, February and March. So if anyone saw this, this will contain some of that same material that I did then, as well as some new material. But there's also some things that I wasn't very happy with about the way that last class series went. So I've kind of removed what was like the last class in that series, that sort of cursory overview of some of the more advanced stuff, to really try to focus more on foundations, and to bring in some other new theoretical and kind of philosophical material, and to try to give people a better sense of what the elements are and what they mean, and how we work with them, and why they're significant and important for magic. So yeah, we'll be talking about the elements themselves, about elemental magic, and about pentagram rituals, which are the primary rituals that work with the elemental forces in our tradition. All right, so I just wanted to open with a quote here. This is from Kurt Seligman. Seligman was a surrealist painter, but he was also a real expert on the esoteric tradition, and he wrote a really wonderful book that was published in the late 40s called The Mirror of Magic, which I really like and recommend it. By academics, it's a kind of history of the magical tradition. By academic standards, it's maybe a little bit out of date, but I think in a lot of ways he was really ahead of his time, and I really like his attitude towards the magical tradition. So here's a quote from his chapter on alchemy. And he says, "There are 4 essences of the universe upon which not only Agrippa, but all the learned through the centuries have agreed. These are fire, water, earth, and air. However, there is a 5th essence, or quintessence, which permeates everything above in the stars and below upon earth. It is the world soul spirit, which animates all bodies. It is clogged with heavy earth." Now he's quoting he's quoting Agrippa, who was quoting Virgil there. "It is clogged with heavy earth and never free or visible. Yet it is omnipresent. And he who can free this 5th element from the matter that it inhabits shall hold in his hand the creative power with which God has endowed the world of matter. The ancient goddesses of growth and vegetation, like Isis, were nothing more to the alchemist than the emblems of the quintessence, the generative power that resides in the philosopher's stone." So this was a nice way to open up, and we'll see a lot of these same themes again. He's referencing Agrippa, that's Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, the extremely important Renaissance Hermeticist, whose works have been one of the foundations of the magical tradition for nearly 500 years now. And we'll see some more stuff from Agrippa as we go on. As we go on, we'll also see a lot of these other themes about the 4 elements, and then also this more mysterious 5th element that arises from them, or is the foundation for them, or is within them, as we'll talk about. And the idea of the alchemical process of extracting the quintessence from the 4 elements, and then also this theme of nature, and especially nature persona, or nature as a goddess, and the world as a living and ensouled being. All right, one more introductory quote. This is from Agrippa, from 3 Books of Occult Philosophy. This is from one of the early chapters where he's talking about the elemental world and the nature of the elements. And he says, And this is the root and foundation of all bodies, natures, virtues, and wonderful works. And he which shall know these qualities of the elements and their mixations shall easily bring to pass such things that are wonderful and astonishing, and shall be perfect in magic. All right, so with that as an introduction, I'm going to spend a few minutes before we get into what different authors in the tradition have said about the elements, of inviting you to maybe bring up some of your own associations with those elements. As I was saying, sort of remarking before we started, really undertaking the practice of ingraining the nature of these elements in the way that you look at the world and the way that you look at yourself is extremely important and matters so much more than any kind of intellectual knowledge or understanding. And of course, formal ritual practice is a big part of that, but it's also just a discipline to use in daily life. Similar, if you've studied astrology, it's so important to recognize, the signature of the planets in yourself and in daily events and in the world around you, and in other people. And the same thing is true of the elements. And so, again, while we'll talk about philosophical and theoretical understandings of these elements, I think it's always really important to return to nature and to the elements as they exist in the natural world, as well as in ourselves. And I don't mean nature like as opposed to culture or as opposed to the human world, but the actual presence of earth, air, fire, and water, and what the actual experience of being near those things and in touch with those things is actually like, because that is the foundation. Although we'll derive metaphorical and broader meanings, not just the physical things, that is the real foundation for this. So the image you're looking at here is one of a set of 4 images. In the Renaissance artistic tradition, there's a number of paintings and engravings and drawings that are allegories of the elements. Sometimes they're done as a single image with all 4 elements represented, like in a single painting, and we'll see a few examples of that in the second part of the series, the second part of our workshop today. But sometimes they're also done as 4 separate images, like the ones you're looking at here. So I'm not really going to get into the specific iconography of these images, just something to look at while we bring up some of our own associations and understandings of the elements. So we're starting here with the element of earth. And so I want to invite you to think about experiences and memories and associations of your own with the element of earth. If you're a gardener or you work with the earth, think about what it's like to touch the earth, to touch soil and dirt, and to have your hands in that, and the fertility of earth. And obviously in that image there we see images of fertility and the growth that emerges from the earth. And we can also think of stones, and rock, and even very large examples of this, like mountains, can be very powerful ways of experiencing that element. Also things like caves or the depths within the earth as well. So one thing you can do, and especially on your own, after this class or in conjunction with ritual work, is to sort of use visualization to help bring up an experiential sense of these elements. Of course, being in touch with them, directly in the natural world is very important, but we can also use visualization to do that as well. So you could imagine, what it's like to be in touch with the earth, and you can even imagine the earthy element within your own body, or you can imagine your body as the earth. Imagine what it would feel like if your body was composed entirely of soil or of stone. How you would move, the heaviness and the density that you would have in your body. And you can even think of what your mind and your psyche would be like if you yourself were entirely composed of the element of earth, or if you were composed of stone. What would your emotions be like? What would your intellect be like? How would your mind and your thoughts work? And this is something you can do in daily life too, not just in formal meditation sessions, but when you're doing things, you can think, if I was entirely composed of earth, how would I move? How would I, do whatever it is that you're doing in your daily life? So yeah, we can just take a moment to, to bring up some of those associations, and to try to feel, in your body and in your psyche, the nature of that element. All right, and then we need to keep moving. But this is a great exercise that you can do, and extend it further, for longer lengths of time. All right, and here we have an image of the element of water. Um, so again, we can bring up associations, experiences and memories of being in touch with water. Whether that's being in the ocean, being in lakes or ponds, being in rivers, even being in the shower or in the bath. What does it feel like to immerse yourself in water? And what does it feel like? I didn't mention on the previous slide there, but with earth, we can think of food and the nourishment, the physical substance that we take in, that our bodies convert into the structure of our bodies. We can do the same with water. Think about what it's like to be thirsty and what it's like to feel dehydrated, and then how it feels to drink water after you've been dehydrated. We can go weeks without eating food, but we can only go a few days without water. Water is absolutely essential to life. And we think about natural environments, especially if you've ever been in a desert or a dry environment. It's very clear how absolutely essential to life water is. And of course, your body is, I forget what they say now, about 70% water. So you yourself are composed of water more than anything else, as are all living things. So again, we can do the same sort of exercise that we did a moment ago, with earth. Think about, imagine if your entire body was fluid and your entire body was made of water. How would that feel? How would you move? How would it feel to be sitting in your chair or on your couch, wherever you are? How would it feel to move around in the world? How would your psyche feel? How would your emotions feel? How would you think? How would you accomplish activities if you yourself were entirely composed of water? So again, we'll just take a minute to try to feel that, and to bring up any associations that you have with water, or any experiential memories of being in water. All right, and we will move on. Here we have an image of the element of air. And so air is an interesting one. It's something that is very easy to escape our notice, but it is present all the time. And so while you can, you can go, like I said, you'll go weeks without eating food, and a few days without water. You can only go a few minutes without breathing air. Air is absolutely essential to life, and we can't be deprived of it for even a few moments. And so when we're thinking about air, not just the atmosphere or the air that surrounds us, but the air that we are constantly bringing into our bodies, that we are breathing in and then exhaling again. And yeah, and again, how essential that is to life and breath. And you can think about different experiences of air. Being in how different does it feel to be in a polluted city where the air quality is very low, compared to maybe a mountain or something like that, where the air is pure and cool. And think of how much that affects, if you've ever lived in a polluted city, how much that affects your sense of well-being. And again, we can bring up these types of experiential associations, especially if anyone do like breath awareness meditations. That's probably given you some insight into the nature of breath. And we can again imagine that what would it be like if your body was composed entirely of air? If you were, a kind of vapor or gas, how would it feel? You wouldn't have the heavy, density of earth. What would it be like? How would you move around? And how would your mind feel? How would your thoughts and emotions feel if you were entirely composed of air? All right, and then we'll move on to our fourth element here, the element of fire. So again, you can bring up associations, and memories of fire. I always think about like sitting around a campfire or a bonfire. Especially if it's cold, and you're using the fire for warmth, or just gazing into the fire, and that kind of hypnotic quality and sort of energizing quality that being close to fire can have. And of course, fire, is also dangerous, right? Fire burns and fire eats things up. It also transforms. We can think about the uses of fire. Whether that's to heat your home, to cook your food. Fire is used in the metallurgy and the transformations of things. Fire radically transforms substances that it comes into contact with. And of course, the human ability to control fire and to use fire is one, if not the sort of seminal events in the development of human civilization. So you can think about the importance that fire has had for our species for probably tens of thousands of years now. And so again, we can do a same sort of exercise of imagine that you yourself are entirely composed of fire. How would it feel to be composed of fire? How would you move around? How would you accomplish, daily activities? Excuse me. How would your mind feel? How would your emotions feel if you were entirely composed of fire? All right, so let's shift gears now, and I want to go back and look at some of the foundations for the theory of how the four elements enters the magical tradition, and of course the four elements are until the modern day are part of not just the magical tradition, but really the entire Western in the broadest sense, a philosophical tradition, and of course other cultures also have similar sorts of theories. There's the five elements, like in the Chinese philosophy, and many other cultures have similar things as well. But the particular tradition that we're most directly the descendant of comes from the Greek tradition. So we're going to look at some of the Greek precursors and look at how the idea and the philosophy of the four elements and five elements emerges. So first we're going to look at, this is Thales, who is often given credit as the first philosopher or the first proto-philosopher. So very little of Thales' there's a few fragments, very little of Thales' work actually survives. So there's some uncertainty about what Thales actually taught. And one of the main sources we have is Aristotle's reports of Thales, of his philosophy. So Aristotle says, however, not all agree about the number and form of such principles. He's talking about like foundational principles, and we'll talk about that idea more in a few minutes. But Thales, the founder of this kind of philosophy, declares it to be water. This is why he indicates that the earth rests on water. Maybe he got this idea from seeing that the nourishment of all things is moist, and that the hut itself comes to be from this and lives on this. The principle of all things is that from which they come to be. Getting this idea from the consideration, and also because the seeds of all things have a moist nature, and water is the principle of the nature of moist things. So it's possible that Aristotle has his own conception of matter and the nature of matter, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. So he may be projecting some of his own theories onto Thales, and taking this as an entirely physical theory, that everything is literally composed of water, in the transformations of water. But some contemporary historians of philosophy have also speculated that Thales was influenced by the Egyptian tradition. Thales lived in Miletus, which is on the eastern coast of modern day Turkey, and we know that they had contact and cultural exchange with Egypt. And so in the Egyptian tradition, water, again, is often the primordial thing. In the beginning, there is only the waters, and the earth is created out of that or rises up from that. And these kind of cosmic primordial waters continue to surround everything that exists. So this is from a really nice book called The Temple of the Cosmos by Jeremy Nadler, and he's talking about this Egyptian conception of kind of cosmological and like cosmogonic conception of water. And so he says, the ancient Egyptians did not literally believe that there was an ocean of water somewhat like the Mediterranean Sea, defining the outermost boundaries of the cosmos. For the waters of noon have an altogether more subtle mode of existence than the waters that we meet with in the physical world. Noon is unrealized potential for existence, symbolized by the formless fluidity of a vast expanse of water. Water best symbolizes the qualities of noon, because although it is the source of life, it is in itself without shape or definition. Hence it exists prior to all forms, whether manifest or unmanifest. So I think this, these two different accounts of the water as a foundational principle, as a literal physical principle, and as something a little bit more metaphoric. And we'll see that running throughout our class today, those two different kind of modes. All right, so our next pre-Socratic philosopher is Anaximenes, who has a similar kind of idea about all things being created or formed out of one singular substance. But for Anaximenes, this is air. So in one of the few surviving fragments that we do have from Anaximenes, he says, just as our soul, being air, holds us together and controls us, so do breath and air surround the whole cosmos. So similar kind of line of thinking perhaps to Thales, where there's the observation, where Thales had the observation of how important water is for life, Anaximenes has the equally true observation of how important air and breath is for life. It's also very interesting to notice here that this is one of probably the earliest instances of a kind of microcosm, macrocosm theory, and probably a precursor to that, where he's saying our soul is air, and that this principle of air, holds us together and controls us, the breath, that vital life breath. And of course, it's worth noting that in many ancient languages, in Greek, pneuma, Latin spiritus, Hebrew nephesh, neshama, and ruach, Sanskrit prana. All these words can mean both breath and spirit. So there's a connection between breath and spirit and air. And so Anaximenes here is saying, just as our soul, being air, holds us together and controls us, so do breath and air surround the whole cosmos. And so as air is to us, so it is also to the cosmos. And so there's an implied equation between our own constitution and the constitution of the entire cosmos. And that idea of microcosm and macrocosm is something we'll come back to a few more times today. All right, and then Theophrastus reports on some of Anaximenes' theories. And he says, Anaximenes, like Anaximander is another pre-Socratic philosopher, Anaximenes declares that the underlying nature is one and apeiron. Apeiron means something like unlimited, or it can sort of mean infinite, but it's sort of a negative thing. It's more of a formless chaos. If anyone attended or listened to the series that we did on the Sephiroth, you'll remember that the even numbers, like in that second class when we talked about Greek philosophy, even numbers are associated with the unlimited and with the formless. That's that same word, apeiron. So that Anaximenes, like Anaximander, says that the underlying principle is one, that it's singular and unitary, and it is apeiron, unlimited and formless, but not indeterminate as Anaximander held. Anaximander said that just the primordial principle is just the apeiron, the unlimited, without further determination. But Anaximenes says that it is definite, saying that it is air. It differs in rarity and density according to the substance it becomes. Becoming finer, it comes to be fire. Being condensed, it comes to be wind, then cloud, and when still further condensed, it becomes water, then earth, then stones, and the rest comes to be out of these. He means the rest of things that exist. And so we can see now he doesn't have the idea of the four elements, right? Because he's giving wind, which is like air, also water and earth and fire here. But he's also mentioning cloud and stones. But we can see the kind of the movement towards that basic idea, and also the idea of a singular substance that again transforms into various other substances. All right, and then the third pre-Socratic philosopher that we'll look at here is Heraclitus. Now, although we have a number of fragments of Heraclitus, it is very difficult to know what Heraclitus actually taught and what many of the fragments means. Heraclitus is often referred to as the obscure philosopher or the riddling philosopher. So it is possible that Heraclitus believed that fire is the fundamental sort of thing that underlies the cosmos. But it's not exactly clear. Heraclitus is probably most famous, for the teaching that everything is constantly in flux and constantly transforming. He's slightly misquoted as saying, "You can't step in the same river twice." But even though that's not exactly what he said, it does capture some of that same sense that everything is constantly changing and doesn't have a stable identity and constantly transforming. So here's a few of the fragments where he talks about fire. So Heraclitus says, "The turnings of fire. First, sea, and of sea half is earth and half fiery water spout. Earth is poured out as sea, and is measured according to the same ratio." And the word ratio here is logos, which some of you may be familiar with. According to the same ratio it was before it became earth. In another fragment he says, "Fire lives the death of earth, and air lives the death of fire. Water lives the death of air, earth that of water." So again, this idea of transformation, that fire lives the death of earth. Earth ceases to be earth and becomes fire. And same with the other elements. Right, in the next fragment he says, "For fire will advance and judge and convict all things." And in the fourth fragment he says, "The cosmos, the same for all, none of the gods nor of humans has made, but it always was and is and shall be, an ever-living fire being kindled in measures and being extinguished in measures." So in all of these three fragments, we see here that they're looking for the basic underlying nature of things, what things most fundamentally and deeply are. And this nature of things is also considered a kind of like a stuff, right? This isn't some like abstract or philosophical principle. We're talking about a substance, something like matter. A kind of stuff or the basic nature of things. And so these words that I'm using here, like nature, stuff, substance, these are all possible translations of the Greek word physis, which is where we get our modern word physics. Now, physis is also the name of a goddess in the Greek tradition. And the Roman equivalent of physis is natura, right? Nature. So this is the goddess nature. And and again, this is where we get our word physics, and the idea of natural philosophy, which eventually becomes, what we now know as science, is this study of physis, the study of the basic nature of things in a physical sense. So this is from the Orphic hymn to the goddess Physis. This is one of the longer hymns, so I'm just going to give you a few excerpts rather than the whole thing. All right, so, "O Physis, resourceful mother of all, industrious and rich divinity, oldest of all, queen, all-taming and indomitable, O lustrous ruler, ever-honored mistress of all, highest goddess, imperishable, firstborn, all partake of you, you alone partake of no one, self-fathered, hence fatherless, virtue itself, joyous, great, you are accessible, O nurse of flowers, you lovingly mingle and twine, you lead and rule, you bring nourishment to all. A rich and mighty divinity, you give shape and form to all things. Eternal, setting all in motion, skilled and discreet, you are ever turning the swift stream into an unceasing eddy, flowing in all things, circular and ever-changing form. You are life everlasting, you are immortal providence, you are all things to all because you alone do. You are the all, you alone do. You bring peace and health, you bring growth to all. See, Stephen says that goddess of the phenomenal. That's really good. I like that, Stephen. Goddess of the phenomenal. Right. Of course, phenomenal has a lot to do, like we think of like phenomenology, that has a lot to do with our experience of things. And so this is kind of a pre-modern sort of, we're founded in what things actually are rather than how they seem to us. So goddess of the phenomenal could be kind of like a modern version of this same basic idea. But yeah, I like that. All right, so then jumping way into the future, I just wanted to show you that in Crowley's works and in Thelema, we really carry on some of this same tradition of talking about nature and is talking about nature and the idea that nature is a single kind of whole, organic, interconnected being that is ensouled and alive, persists into the Thelemic tradition. All right, so this is, I have a few quotations here, these two, and then another one on the next slide, from Little Essays Towards Truth. This is in a chapter about energy, but Crowley kind of uses talking about energy as a digression into what is, I think, his clearest statement about nature. So this first quote just sort of sets up the stage for the others. So he says, "There is only one magical operation of whose propriety we may always be sure, and that is the increase of the sum of our energy. Energy being increased, nature will herself supply clarity. Our vision is obscure only because our energy is deficient, for energy is the substance of the universe." And so again, we're not really talking about magical procedures for increasing energy, although we will see things later on that definitely do that. But you can see here that Crowley's still talking about this idea of the substance of the universe, although he's saying it's energy. All right, and then the next quotation here, he says, "It is a strangely convincing proof of the true care of nature for her instruments, despite the superficial evidence to the contrary on which the doctrines of pessimism are based, that the most precious, the only ultimate essential grace that can possibly be bestowed on mankind is, of all magical benefit, that which may be attained with more ease and certainty than any other." And he means the increase of energy. That's the grace that he's talking about here. "For energy is itself all that is, and we vary with the quantity and quality thereof, which we can call ourselves." So we ourselves are energy and part of this singular, connected nature. "The price which she, nature, demands is without doubt heavy enough for a certain class, but it is equally to be paid in varying degree for every type of mystical and magical adventure." And then just continuing here. "This price is in essence the full understanding of the mind of nature herself and complete sympathy with her way of work. All the moral codes of mankind, for all their absurd diversities, have one common factor. They pretend to have found motives and methods which are superior to hers. That is, they presume a conception of the end which is beyond her view. They assert the possession of an intelligence loftier than that which has produced the universe. Consider only that the highest manifestation possible to the rational mind is the discovery of the laws which summarize her manner of operation." So again, these laws, the discovery of the laws that summarize the manner of nature's operations, that is most essentially what we call physics. And I'm sure Crowley's thinking of the works of people like Newton or Maxwell or Faraday or Einstein here. So continuing, "We may then say at once that all such pretentious arrogance is impudence and absurdity, and it must be surrendered, nay more, uprooted and calcined." Calcined means to burn something in a high heat, and it's a chemical term. "Uprooted and calcined before any serious progress can be made in the royal and sacerdotal art." Again, that's referring to alchemy again. "Hence also any aspiration of a partial order, any which depends for its wisdom on the justice of our perceptions of our own needs, is almost certain to be tainted with the very poison of which nature would purge us." All right, and then one more kind of quote from Crowley here. And this is from the essay Duty, where he summarizes the application of the law of Thelema. First, the law of Thelema in relationship to ourselves, what the law of Thelema implies of our duty in relationship to ourselves, then our duty in relation to other people, then our duty in relationship to all other humans and to society, and then finally the duty to all living things and to all things whatsoever. So this is from that fourth section there. And Crowley says, "It is a violation of the law of Thelema to abuse the natural qualities of any animal or object by diverting it from its proper function, as determined by consideration of its history and structure." So now the law of Thelema, of course, is do what thou wilt. And so if it's a violation of that law to abuse the natural qualities of any animal or object, that implies that animals and all living things and ultimately all objects have a will. Maybe not in the same sense, especially with inanimate objects, maybe not the same type of will or will in the same sense that we have. But in essence, everything has a will, which is its own nature. Thus, to train children to perform mental operations or to practice tasks for which they are unfitted is a crime against nature, similar to build houses of rotten material, to adulterate food, to destroy forests, etc., is to offend. The law of Thelema is to be applied unflinchingly to decide every question of conduct. The inherent fitness of anything for any proposed use should be the sole criterion. The wise application based on observation and experience of the law of Thelema is to work in conscious harmony with evolution. Experiments in creation involving variation from existing types are lawful and necessary. Their value is to be judged by their fertility as bearing witness to their harmony with the course of nature towards perfection. So that was the introduction to a more Thelemic way of thinking about these same topics. And we can see how continuous the tradition really is here. And also how the law of Thelema is applied to the elements and the nature of the elements and to all beings and living things. All right, so jumping back now to the Greek tradition, another pre-Socratic philosopher we have here is Empedocles. Empedocles is really the source of the four elements that we have. Although Empedocles doesn't actually use the word elements, Empedocles calls these the roots. It's Plato who has an interest in Empedocles' work, who begins to call these four things elements, but Empedocles calls them roots, which is a nice way of thinking about it, I think, of thinking about the elements as the roots of things. All right, so this is some excerpts from a longer piece of Empedocles here. Let's see, he says, "For the coming together of all things produces one birth and destruction, and the other is nurtured and flies apart when they grow apart again. And these never cease continually interchanging. At one time, all coming together into one by love, and at another, each being borne apart by the hatred of strife." So this idea of love and strife are the two sort of functions, they're not substances or elements, but sort of things that happen, or the two kind of like operations or something like that, are love and strife for Empedocles. And in maybe less poetic terms, we could think of this as something like attraction and repulsion, coming together and breaking apart, which is very similar to the alchemical ideas of coagula, that would be like love, bringing things together, and then solve, which is like strife of taking things apart and analyzing things. Let's see, Pacem comments here, the four aces of the tarot are the root of each element. Indeed, and we will see the four aces of the tarot in the second part of our workshop today. All right, moving on here. For at any one time, they grow to be only one out of many, but at another, they grow apart to be many out of one, fire and water and earth and the immense height of air. For these are all equal and of the same age. Now, of the same age, he means that none of them are like more like primordial or more foundational than the others. They are co-eternal, right? It's not like water transforms into the other three or air transforms into the other three. All four are originary principles. And Empedocles says that they can't transform, that they're always themselves, though we'll see how Aristotle disagrees with that and varies this tradition. Let's see. So they are all equal and of the same age, but each rules its own province and possesses its own individual character, but they dominate in turn as time revolves. But there are just these very things, and running through one another at different times, they come to be different things, and yet are always and continuously the same. So again, these four elements, by the operations of love and strife, combine and then break apart again in different combinations and form all the diversity that we see in the world. All right, and then we will, last of our trip into Greek philosophy here, we'll look at Aristotle, who really sets up what becomes the entire tradition, lasting all the way up until the modern era, and continuing in the esoteric tradition to the current day. So these are all excerpts from a fairly long treatise and a very detailed and somewhat complex treatise of Aristotle's. It's usually known in Latin as De Generatione et Corruptione, which is like of degeneration and corruption, or of generation and corruption, not degeneration and corruption, of generation and corruption, which is sometimes also given as of coming to be and passing away. You'll see it translated into English. So it's here that Aristotle really engages with Empedocles and other pre-Socratic philosophers and really develops his idea of the four elements and their natures. All right, so first quotation here, he says, "We must reckon as an originative source and as primary the matter which underlies," and again, we can see the same idea of physis, of something that is basic and primary. The matter which underlies, though it is inseparable from the contrary qualities. For the hot is not matter for the cold, nor the cold for the hot, but the substratum is matter for them both. And so this idea of a kind of substratum is Aristotle's conception of a matter, without qualities, but that it takes on these qualities of hot and cold, and as we'll see, of moist and dry. But the substratum is matter for them both. We therefore have to recognize three originative sources. Firstly, that which is potentially perceptible body, and this he means like matter itself without qualities, which is completely imperceptible but potentially perceptible. Secondly, the contraries, e.g. heat and cold, and then later on in the treatise he adds moist and dry to heat and cold. And thirdly, fire, water, and the like. Only thirdly, however, for these bodies change into one another, whereas the contraries do not change. So he's disagreeing with Empedocles here. And the esoteric tradition will follow along with Aristotle here. All right, so then in the second quote here, he says, "It is evident that the couplings of the elementary qualities will be four: hot with dry and moist with hot, and again cold with dry and cold with moist." He had just said that hot and cold can't pair together because they mutually are exclusive. Something can't be hot and you can be neutral, neither hot nor cold. These aren't like binary things. Something can be more hot or more cold than something else. But it can't be simultaneously hot and cold, right? Same thing with dry and moist. So you only have four possible combinations: hot and dry, hot and moist, cold and dry, and cold and moist. And he says, and these four couplings have attached themselves to the apparently simple bodies, fire, air, water, and earth, in a manner consonant with theory. For fire is hot and dry, whereas air is hot and moist, air being a sort of aqueous vapor. And water is cold and moist, while earth is cold and dry. So that basic matter or kind of primal substance, by taking on the qualities of hot, cold, moist, and dry, becomes the four elements. All right, and then he also has an account of how these things transform into each other. And so he says, air, e.g., for example, will result from fire if a single quality, I think I wrote quality twice there. If a single quality changes, for fire, as we saw, is hot and dry, while air is hot and moist. So that there will be air if the dry be overcome by the moist. Again, water will result from air if the hot be overcome by the cold. So that the elements can transform into each other by the changing of their qualities. And so this also implies that the elements, that like fire can't directly transform into water, because while fire is hot and dry, water is cold and wet. So for fire to become water, it has to change both of its qualities, whereas fire can become air by becoming moist and remaining hot, or it can become earth by remaining dry and becoming cold. So you need sort of two steps of transformation to get from fire to water, or from earth to air, and only one step for the others. All right, also in Aristotle, we have an important idea that you should be aware of, which is the idea of natural place. Now, we know that this idea is not true. Modern physics has absolutely overturned this. But Aristotle has the idea that the four elements, and this accounts for like physical properties, including like gravity and all these, what we call gravity and all these other sort of things, Aristotle says happens because the four elements each seek their natural place. So fire and air rise, and fire rises the highest, while earth and water sink towards the center of the earth, and earth, being the densest and heaviest, sinks the furthest. Yeah, so that explains basically all or most physical properties, is that the elements each seeking their natural place. And this becomes an important cosmological idea. On the left, some of you have seen this diagram before. I've used it in a couple of previous classes that I've done. This is a pre-modern conception based on Aristotle's worldview of the nature of the cosmos. And so in the center, we have the planet that we live in. Again, this is obviously a geocentric model, right? With the Earth as the center. And the Earth is divided up into these 4 realms. And you can see there's a close-up of that center there. And so we can see in the center here, we have dry land and water around it there. And then we have the airy region. This would be like the atmosphere. And then above that, the fiery region, or a kind of firmament or aether, that Aristotle and others believed was above the airy part of our atmosphere. And then beyond that is the sphere of the moon. So for Aristotle, while the elements, the 4 elements of fire, air, water, and earth continuously transform into each other, which is why we are mortal, because everything is constantly in flux and constantly changing, and that's why things are born and things die. That's why there is impermanence in this world. Beyond the world of the 4 elements, everything is not made of the 4 elements, but of a 5th element, or quintessence, which is eternal and immutable. And this is what composes the planets and stars, and this is related to Aristotle's idea that the planets and stars are eternal, that they never change. Of course, they have their cycles, their orbits, but those orbits are eternal. They always have existed and always will exist. But so this 5th element is incorruptible, but it doesn't exist here on Earth, only from the sphere of the moon and beyond. All right, and then again, this is a slide that some of you have seen before, contrasting the geocentric cosmology with the heliocentric cosmology. And so in the change from the heliocentric cosmology, although they end up looking fairly similar, you just move the sun into the center, and then the Earth, along with the sphere of the moon, they kind of swaps places with where the sun had been, and you can see that in the diagram on the right. So although it's not incredibly different in some ways, it does overturn Aristotle's theory of the 4 elements, and especially with Tycho Brahe and others' observations that actually things beyond the sphere of the moon, Brahe's observation of comets was important for this, that actually things beyond the sphere of the moon do change and aren't like Aristotle said, and now we understand that the planets and stars and the entire physical universe are all composed of the same type of matter, and they all change. They're all born and die, just as things here on Earth do. And so this implies a different conception of the quintessence, and a conception of the quintessence that isn't spatialized. It's not like the 4 elements are here and the quintessence is up beyond the Earth, but it has to be thought of in a different way, as something that is either behind or within all things, not spatially separated. All right, let's keep moving on here. So yeah, I think that at least for the moment concludes some of our survey of like traditional ways of looking at things and where some of these ideas come from. So we can start talking about them in the way that we will use them, and in their significance for magic and our tradition. So here you see fire, water, air, and earth, as well as the alchemical glyphs associated with them. These glyphs are, I don't know exactly when they start being used, but they come out of the alchemical tradition. And I've also color-coded them here with the modern colors that we primarily associate with the elements. So fire we associate with the color red, pretty obvious. Water with the color blue, air with the color yellow, and we see that that's the 3 primary colors of red, blue, and yellow that combine to form the other colors. And then earth is traditionally, and for most practical purposes, is given the color black, though some of you may be aware that in some of the Thelemic writings, like in the Thelemic holy books, there's this idea of the color of earth changing from black to green. That's important symbolically, but less important for practical purposes. And I think in my understanding, the main idea there is the the change from seeing, like earth and matter as like a dead or inert thing to something that is vital and full of life. Although if we look back to the Egyptian tradition, we don't need to change colors to have that changed understanding. For the Egyptians, black is the color of life and fertility, whereas red is the color of like death and sterility, because the areas of Egypt that received the Nile flood each year, that was like the rich soil where crops could be grown. That soil was black, whereas outside of that area in the desert, the sand is a red color. So black is the color of fertility and life and vitality for the Egyptians. So yeah, that symbolic change is important, but we will use the color black for earth, for practical and ritual purposes. So you're welcome to experiment with changing that if that's something you're interested in doing. All right, so on the left here, we've got Aristotle's qualities with the elements. So we can see that fire and air are hot, and water and earth are cold, that air and water are wet, and fire and earth are dry. Yeah, so again, that idea of the permutations of these four qualities. And so this isn't Aristotle. This is more coming from really coming more from like the astrological and also the medical tradition in traditional medicine. I'll mention this briefly in the second part of the series today, but these ideas of hot and cold and wet and dry also form the basis for a lot of traditional medicine. So I've made, these are my own kind of qualities based on, my readings and study to try to give you some indication of what these qualities mean. And so I'm trying to set them up in like pairs of opposites. Let's see, someone's asking about accessing this recording. Yeah, I'll put it up on YouTube. It'll be up in the next few days. On the Temple of Silver Stars YouTube channel. Okay, so for hot and cold, for hot, I've written energetic. We can also think of fast, moving, tending to increase energy is hot, whereas cold is slowing down or decreasing energy and is also calm. And we can think of, just in our daily language, we say that someone is cool, or someone is being fiery, or someone is on a sports player, something that is on fire, or is hot, right? So these qualities have a very intuitive sense, and it shows up in our language a lot. Yeah, right. If you're hot under the collar, you need to go cool down, right? Like there's something very intuitive about this that part of that is probably the survival of more traditional ways of thinking, and I think a lot of it is just very, very intuitive and obvious. Also, it's hot is active, whereas cold is often given as passive or more reserved. Hot is like projecting, more like an outward, maybe kind of like extroverted motion, whereas cold is, again, often given as passive. It's receiving and taking in. Hot is engaging, whereas cold is more like observing. And I tried to give qualities here that work both, for like physical things, as well as for the individual like personality and psyche, and for the idea of temperament. And then for wet and dry, I said that wet is flexible, right? It's fluid, and dry. And again, we can think of the elements that are wet, right? That's air and water, right? And they are, they're a gas, they're or a liquid, right? They change forms, they adapt to the shape of their container. Whereas dry is less flexible and has structure and the potential for structure. Also, I've given here for wet, I said mysterious, whereas dry is clear. Like dry is looking at things, and again, this is something that shows up in our language. Someone who's dry, or you can even think of like dry senses of humor and things like that are all very useful like points of reference. And in the wet is fertile, where dry is sober. Wet is uniting, whereas dry is analyzing or separating. And again, with sober and dry, that's again something we find in our language. An alcoholic goes to rehab to dry out, or someone who's a theory that's way off base. That theory is all wet, right? We actually still talk in this way. And in all of these things, while people will have their own natural state, some people will be more hot or more cool, more wet or more dry. The ideal is always balance, and being out of balance in one direction or other can cause problems. I've actually been thinking about this a lot recently about the qualities of wet and dry, where I was thinking, that things like kind of conspiracy theory type thinking, or even some of the maybe less desirable forms of like new age type thought, I think is very wet and is characterized being very wet. Whereas an extreme skepticism or an extreme like materialism or an extreme like reductivism is excessively dry. And so again, we can see that idea of fertility, whereas like an extremely skeptical or dry point of view doesn't sort of lead to a lot of things. It tends to take meaning and significance and imagination sort of out of the world, whereas an excessively wet point of view is kind of excessively fertile and giving rise to all sorts of really wild, ungrounded theories. Yeah, there's so much more we could say about that, but hopefully that gives you a basic sense of what the qualities are like. And then you can think about how those combine, how the hot and dry combine to form fire, how the cold and wet combine to be water. All right, also following from Aristotle, this is a little bit complex, but I'll try to give you an overview here. We also have the idea of again, that idea of the transformation of the elements and the combination of them. So this is from a book of Leibniz's. It's his dissertation on the art of combination. He's sort of following from the earlier work of Raymond Lully. In this work of Leibniz, in this idea of like permutations of binary categories and the combination of those things, basically leads Leibniz to essentially develop the idea of a computer. And so this is really, in a way, this part of the tradition really like leads up to modern like computing and the idea of being able to do complex things by increasingly elaborate permutations of binary states. All right, so let's talk through this diagram a little bit here. So we see the four elements. Ignis is fire, air is air, aqua is water, and terra is earth. And then in between them, we see the qualities that they share. So Sikitas, that's dryness, and that's shared by fire and earth. Kalidatus is heat, and that's shared by fire and air. Humiditas is moisture, wetness, and that's shared by air and water. And then Frigitatis is cold, and that's shared by earth and water. And then in the bars connecting the different qualities, it shows the relationship between them. So looking at the elements here, we see that fire and water are contrary to each other, right? And as are earth and air. They're contrary. They don't share any of their qualities in common. Whereas, and this odd word here is symbolizantia. I think from the context and the etymology of that word, it means something like sharing something in common or having something in common. And that's what, earth, shares dryness with fire and, shares cold with water. So that's those relationships there. And then we also see relationships between the qualities. So dryness here, this is like possible combination with heat. And has also a possible combination with cold, but it is the impossible combination between dryness and humidity. And then same thing with heat has an impossible combination with cold and possible combinations with dryness and moisture. And then around the outside, if you read in like the direction that the words are going, you see some of you have like remissa, that means diminishing, and then summa, meaning highest. So fire here would be like dryness diminishing, but heat, the highest heat, right? So we like Kalidatus summa is ignis, whereas like Sikitas remissa, right, dryness decreasing. And so the idea is of a permutation of these two cycles. Right, I hope that makes sense. I don't want to spend too much time on that. But this leads to other ideas of cycles, including like the cycles of the seasons, the cycles of the moon, where you always have of the qualities and the opposite qualities. At any given point, one is increasing and the other is decreasing, and the two cycles are like offset from each other, giving this constant like cyclic transformation. Let's just move on. That's something in an upcoming series that I'm going to lead on planetary magic. That's some idea we might come back to, because like I said, it's relevant for like the solar and lunar cycles and some other things in astrology as well. All right, another idea coming out of like the ancient Greek tradition is of attributing the 4 directions to the 4 elements. And this is based on the idea of the winds. And this is like what it's like in the winds in the Mediterranean world. So the north is associated with earth, and this is sort of dry and cold winds that came from the north. East is associated with air. These are sort of warmer and somewhat humid winds, that came from the east. Fire is associated with the south because of hot and dry winds that came from the south. And then west is associated with water because of very humid and rain that would come in from the west. So of course, those that idea of the winds aren't relevant in all parts of the world, but these correspondences between the 4 directions and the 4 elements are, we take these to be more than just, the qualities of, particular climates, but it's actually magical correspondences that we can use in any part of the world. And so these also become not just the winds, but also the quarters. And so when we're working in ritual, we attribute like the northern quarter of our ritual space to earth, the eastern quarter of our ritual space to air, the southern quarter of our ritual space to fire, and the western quarter of our ritual space to water. And that's something we will put into practice with the pentagram rituals. See, I see a few people typing. Yeah, feel free to jump in. Even if I've moved on to another slide, I'm happy to jump back if people have questions or comments or anything like that. Let's see. Jinji is asking, would you suggest having a compass on your altar? I mean, there's nothing wrong with having a compass if that's something that you would like. I mean, a compass can be a nice way of just establishing the directions. Now, for practical purposes, if you live in a house where the walls are not aligned with north, south, east, and west, but are rather diagonal, you can kind of round off, to the nearest direction. It doesn't need to be absolute, like due east, but just whichever wall is closest to east. So having a compass might be a little bit funny if it's pointing off at a bit of an angle from your ritual space, but it's certainly something you could do if you wanted to. Yeah, definitely. And I think that would be really interesting. There's no time for it today, but to do a comparison between the Western elements and some of the Eastern traditions. Yeah, definitely. Because there's a lot in common, but there's also differences. Yeah, Temple East, right? And occasionally, if it's really a problem, you could even sort of magically set up a temple so that a direction that isn't east is the east that you use for magical purposes. It's not ideal, but if that's what you need to do, that it does work. It's just important that I would think that it's important that you always use the ritual space with the directions in the same way. Sort of shifting things around for different purposes is probably going to get confusing. It's important to really build up those associations. But yeah, if you need to do things in another direction, because for most ritual purposes you're facing east primarily, that's fine. All right, so now that we've built up some of the basic ideas about the 4 elements, I wanted to look in a little bit more detail about some of the traditional writings on them. So I want to look at some of the comments from Agrippa from his 3 books of occult philosophy. Now, Agrippa actually has a lot to say about the elements, so I'm really just giving some excerpts from some not extremely long chapters, but some pretty detailed things that Agrippa has to say, and he summarizes a number of the opinions of some classical and earlier authors. So if you're interested in this, or you're interested in Agrippa, there's a lot, and it's all right at the beginning of the book that he talks about the elements. All right, so this is Agrippa on fire. All right, so fire, as saith Dionysus. Dionysus, he means Dionysus the Areopagite. Fire in all things and through all things comes and goes away bright. It is in all things bright, and at the same time occult and unknown. When it is by itself, no other matter coming to it in which it should manifest its proper action. It is boundless and invisible, of itself sufficient for every action that is proper to it, movable, yielding itself after a manner to all things that come next to it, renewing, guarding nature, enlightening, not comprehended by lights that are veiled over, clear, parted, leaping back, bending upwards, quick in motion, high, always raising motions, comprehending another, not comprehended itself, not standing in need of another, secretly increasing of itself and manifesting its greatness to things that receive it, active, powerful, invisibly present in all things at once. It will not be affronted or opposed, but as it were in a way of revenge, it will reduce on a sudden thing, on a sudden things into obedience to itself, incomprehensible, impalatable, not lessened, most rich in all dispensations of itself. So yeah, we're not going to go through this, a lot of detailed discussion here, but just sort of take what you can from what he's saying. And some of this stuff is somewhat obscure. But yeah, just sort of get what you can, absorb what you can. All right, so I'm going in the order of the elements that Agrippa gives them. He goes from fire to earth here. So let's see, he says, now the basis and foundation of all the elements is the earth, for that is the object, subject, and receptacle of all celestial rays. He means like the influence coming from the planets and stars. Let's see, the receptacle of all celestial rays and influences. In it are contained the seeds and seminal virtues of all things, and therefore it is said to be animal, vegetable, and mineral, right? That's the three kingdoms, which summarize all things on earth are divided into animal, vegetable, and mineral. It being made, in traditional thought, it being made fruitful by the other elements and the heavens brings forth all things of itself. It receives the abundance of all things and is, as it were, the first fountain, from whence all things spring. It is the center, foundation, and mother of all things. Take as much of it as you please, separated, washed, and depurated. That means like purified. Subtilized, if you let it lie in the open air a little while, it will bring, it will, being full and abounding with heavenly virtues, of itself bring forth plants, worms, and other living things. Now, Agrippa is referring to what we now know is the untrue idea of spontaneous generation. That life spontaneously, like the idea that like maggots spontaneously emerge out of rotting meat. People didn't realize that flies had laid their eggs in there. But at the same time, it's in a way no less miraculous that a small seed within the earth brings forth plants than if the earth did it itself. And of course, while that's not sort of continuously true, life did arise. Organic life did arise out of organic matter. So 4.5 billion years ago, this did happen, right? Or is continuing to happen. I mean, we're now in a 4.5 billion year long process of life emerging out of the earth. Let's see. Also, stones and bright sparks of metal. In it, in earth, are great secrets. If at any time it shall be purified by the help of fire and reduced into its simplicity by a convenient washing. So again, he's thinking about these things in alchemical and transformative ways. It is the first matter of our creation and the truest medicine that can restore and preserve us. Let's see, we got a comment that came in here. Let's see, Maria says, I've been wondering how to do magic in my space. I live on the road, so my rig is always facing different directions, and today's west may be the back, while tomorrow it's the side. Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, I suppose you could try to, or angle it, so that you're facing, the same direction, but let's see, Friday Pentagram here is suggesting chapter 23 of Magic Without Tears. I'm not, I don't know which off the top of my head, which chapter is chapter 23, but I'm sure that's a good suggestion. Oh, improvising a temple. Okay, yeah. Crowley has a lot of great suggestions about improvisation. I mean, there's some funny things about, like, if you don't have a robe, you can use a bathrobe. If you don't have a candle or a lamp, you can use a match, right? So it's definitely always better to do things than to not do things, no matter how imperfect. Yeah, that's tricky, but I mean, getting good at improvising and learning what's truly essential and what isn't essential can also be really excellent lessons. If you were to start off Magick with a fully well stocked temple, there are probably lessons that you would never learn. So at the same time, that is a challenge, and maybe may seem to be a disadvantage. There's also a lot of extremely valuable things that you can learn from that process. And of course, experimentation is important. Like, take notes, and keep a record of what you're doing. See if facing more or less in the correct directions, do you actually get different results than if you don't? See what actually works and what doesn't work, and try out different things and experiment. Great. All right, let's move along here with Agrippa. So now Agrippa on water. Let's see. Just a shorter excerpt from this one, although he has a lot to say about water. Oh, Packham is providing a link here. Thank you. All right, so he says, there is so great a necessity of water that without it no living thing can live. No herb nor plant whatsoever without the moistening of water can branch forth. In it is the seminary virtue of all things, especially of animals, whose seed is manifestly waterish. Right, and he's talking about semen, obviously. The seeds also of trees and plants, although they are earthy, must notwithstanding of necessity be rotted in water before they can be fruitful. Right, and this is something that gardeners do. You have to soak your seeds, some types of seeds anyways, in water to get them to germinate. Let's see, whether they be imbibed with the moisture of the earth or with dew or rain or any other water that is on purpose put to them. All right, and then Agrippa on air. He says, it remains that I speak of the air. This is a vital spirit passing through all beings, giving life and subsistence to all things, binding, moving, and filling all things. Hence it is that the Hebrew doctors reckon it not amongst the elements, but count it as a medium or glue, joining things together, and as the resounding spirit of the world's instrument. It immediately receives into itself the influences of all celestial bodies and then communicates them to the other elements, as also to all mixed bodies. Also, it receives into itself, as if it were a divine looking glass, the species of all things, as well natural as artificial, as also of all manner of speeches. I think he's talking about the idea that speech or sound, right, carries through the air and retains them, and carrying them with it and entering into the bodies of man and other animals through their pores makes an impression upon them, as well as when they sleep as when they be awake, and affords matter for diverse strange dreams and divinations. And then he goes on to discuss the idea that dreams come to us through the air, and that air is like this medium for subtle impressions coming to us. And he even talks about, I think the example he uses is being in a place where people have been hanged. Though of course, we can also think of places where any kind of tragedy or traumatic event has occurred, and the idea that we in that space pick up some of the what we might now call energy or vibration of that space. Agrippa talks about those things being conveyed to us through the air, and that air is the medium through which those types of influences come to us. Junji, I'll give you my email at the end, my email address at the end. And if you send me an email, I'll be happy to send you a copy of the slides, and then you can have them all. I can send them to you as a PDF. No problem. I just figure that's easier than you having to snap pics, continuously while we go through this. All right, and then finally, Agrippa also talks about the quintessence, about this fifth element. All right, so he says they conceive such a medium. He's talking about the quintessence or spirit. They conceive such a medium to be the spirit of the world, namely that which we call the quintessence, because it is not from the four elements, but a certain. Now, I think this is an error in the typesetting here. In this edition, it says, but a certain first thing. I think that should really be fifth thing, But anyways. But a certain fifth thing, having its being above and besides the four, or above the four. There is therefore such a kind of spirit required to be, as it were, the medium, whereby celestial souls are joined to gross bodies and bestow upon them wonderful gifts. This spirit is after the same manner in the body of the world as ours is in the body of man. So again, we see that idea of microcosm and macrocosm. As in the world, so in the individual. For as the powers of our soul are communicated to the members of the body by the Spirit, so also the virtue of the soul of the world is diffused through all things by the quintessence. For there is nothing found in the whole world that hath not a spark of the virtue thereof, right? The quintessence is omnipresent within all things. Yet it is more, nay, most of all, infused into those things which have received or taken in motion this Spirit. Now this spirit is received or taken in by the rays of the stars, so far forth as things render themselves comfortable to them. By this spirit, therefore, every occult property is conveyed into herbs, stones, metals, and animals, through the sun, moons, planets, and through stars higher than the planets, right? So he's talking about the idea of correspondences, and the idea that, plants, stones, animals, and other things on Earth take in the qualities of the stars and the celestial world. And that's something we talked about at length in our the Paz Letters and Correspondences series that we did about 6 months ago or so. And that's up on YouTube as well, if you're interested in that whole topic of correspondences between the things in the world and the celestial powers and all that. Let's see, where were we? Now this spirit may be more advantageous to us if anyone knew how to separate it from the elements, right? So he's talking about that alchemical abstraction. Or at least to use those things chiefly, which do most abound with this spirit. For these things in which this spirit is less drowned in a body and less checked by matter, do more powerfully and perfectly act, and also more readily generate their like. For in it are all generative and seminary virtues, for which cause the alchemists endeavor to separate this spirit from gold and silver. So again, the idea of extracting the quintessence from matter and from the world. All right, so a few more things on alchemy and the elements in alchemy. Another way, and I think a useful way of classifying the elements, in addition to the hot, cold, wet, and dry, is, well, first of all, active and passive correspond to hot and cold. You'll see that the hot elements, fire and air, are precisely the active elements, and the cold elements, water and earth, are precisely the passive elements. And although I'm not endorsing this idea, you will see in the tradition that association of the active and hot elements with the male or with the masculine, and the passive or cold elements with the feminine. And so again, there's nothing kind of normative or anything like that we need to take from that, but it is symbolism that you should be aware of. And I think that's largely, it may be several things, of course. The properties of the elements, and this is true in astrology as well, of planets and things like that. Those things tend to get gendered by the society's understanding of what the genders are like. So you can actually see a lot of agreement in different astrological traditions about the nature of the sun or moon, whether different cultures decide that the sun is masculine and the moon feminine, or the other way around, or that they're both masculine, have more to do with the culture's understanding of what the genders are like than an actual differing understanding of what the planets or elements are like. So they tend to gender things by their own understanding of what the natures of the genders are, if that makes sense. And of course, there's also some procreative symbolism as well. In heterosexual, vaginal intercourse, there's an analogy to transmitting and receiving, and so part of it is that as well. And this is something I've been thinking about, and I'm sure some of you heard me talk about as well. The idea that people often talk about that as sexual symbolism, but I like to think of it as procreative symbolism, of course, because sexuality is so much broader than that one form. But that the procreation and the act of procreation is something that I think exists in in the collective unconscious. It's not like a normative for human sexuality, but it is the the form of human procreation and animal procreation in general, right? All right, so active and passive. And then now this is a different quality that doesn't correspond with any of the hot, cold, wet, and dry, but of volatile and fixed. So fire and water are conceived to be the volatile elements, and then earth and air are conceived to be the fixed elements. And we can see that, I didn't mention on one of the previous slides, you can see that the active elements are the hot elements, are the upward pointing triangles. And that again is that Aristotelian idea of the fire and air rising, whereas water and earth sink, right? And so you can see that the triangles point in the direction of that Aristotelian idea of the of the natural places. And then the bar that crosses through air and earth designates the fixed elements. So we can see that that bar is like the fixation of the elements. And if you're familiar with alchemical symbolism, that should make some sense. For example, one alchemical way of depicting like the fixation of the volatile is like a serpent being pierced by a sword, or like pinned to something like a tree or another object by a sword. So it's that idea of like a bar or something that pierces and fixes something volatile in place. And that idea of fire and water as the volatile elements, I think, there's an intuitive kind of sense, right? Water extinguishes fire, fire boils and transforms water, whereas air and earth don't particularly interact with each other. Sure, I mean, over long periods of time, wind erodes earth, but mostly they don't interact. And so the volatile is like the interacting, and then the fixed is more like non-interacting. And that becomes an important cosmological idea. And we'll see that in the second half of the class when we look at Kabbalah, that fire and water are like productive and give rise to air and earth, whereas air and earth aren't particularly productive in their interactions. All right, and then also on the right there, you see the quintessence or spirit, which we're going to symbolize by the color white, and that 8-spoked wheel there is the symbol of spirit. I've never actually found where exactly that symbol comes from, or what the reasoning behind that 8-spoked wheel for spirit is. Though I certainly have my speculations and ideas. That's an interesting thing that you could kind of meditate on and come to your own conclusions about. Let's see. So David's saying, I'm not clear on how air could be characterized as fixed. Obviously, in its action, it's not. It is active, right? And so we want to distinguish like active from volatile and passive from fixed. It's certainly active and moves around. I think my take on the idea of fixation has more to do with reactivity, that the fixed are less reactive. And that's true. I mean, air, again, fire is extremely reactive, compared to air, which is more inert. So that's how I tend to think about it, is that the fixed is like the inert, whereas the volatile is like the reactive. I don't know. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Yeah. This isn't like an extremely important idea. I just think it's kind of interesting and helpful. But with all of these things, different authors and in different parts of the tradition over time have said different things and don't always agree. And you can make your own way through it and come to your own conclusions. All right, let's see. I think we're doing pretty good on time here. Just a couple more things before we get into pentagram rituals. All right. So this is from a really nice book by Titus Burckhardt, who is a German author. I believe his book Alchemy, was written in the kind of late 50s, or maybe published in early 60s. It's not a huge book, but it's dense, but really interesting. I like it a lot. All right. So he says, true alchemy never regarded earth, water, air, and fire as corporeal or chemical substances in the present day sense of the word. Anytime anyone's saying like true alchemy always did something, I think there's always cause to be a little bit suspicious of that. And of course, there can be that kind of, like no true Scotsman, if you're familiar with that logical fallacy, that you can say, alchemists thought this, and then if you have a counterexample, they say, oh, well, that's not a true alchemist. And then you can kind of assert whatever you want. So take that with a grain of salt. But I think it's an important idea that he's expressing here. So he says, true alchemy never regarded earth, water, air, and fire as corporeal or chemical substances in the present day sense of the word. The four elements are simply the primary and most general qualities by means of which the amorphous and purely quantitative substance of all bodies first reveals itself in differentiated form. The immutable essence of each element has likewise nothing to do with any corporeal indivisibility, and in reality the fact that water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen, and air of oxygen and nitrogen, in no wise alter the immediate experience of four fundamental conditions of corporeal materia, of which earth, water, air, and fire are the most general examples. Even the chemical constituents into which the first three items can be broken down fall themselves into these categories. So there's a couple ways that I think that we can think about this idea. One thing you'll see commonly is the idea that the elements are like the four states of matter, so that earth is solid, water is liquid, air is gaseous, and then fire is either like energy or plasma, or force or energy in general. That's a very common idea that you'll encounter. But you can also, I think, in a way, what he's talking about here maybe points more to like more of a phenomenological or sort of intuitive understanding about these things, that these four things represent qualities in our experience of the world, right? And from a certain philosophical point of view, our experience and our like phenomenological experience of the world is really the primary and foundational thing. Especially like in modern philosophy, following after Kant, there's a sense of starting, with the human psyche and our perception and our experiences and how we gain knowledge, rather than sort of abstractly starting with what the world is in itself and then later coming to how we come to know it. So I think this is a nice kind of modern way of looking at these things that he's suggesting here. All right, one more slide on alchemical elements. So again, this is again from Burckhardt. So he says, the common basis of the four elements, when one looks at things in general and in a synthetic manner, is none other than the materia prima of the world. You'll also see this given as prima materia, same thing. Word order in Latin is less important. It means the first matter or the primary matter. Let's see. So looking at these things more exactly, and there's a lot of ideas about the primary matter that differentiates itself into the different forms of matter that we experience, and a stage in the alchemical process is of reducing things back to the primary matter to then extract the quintessence, or to be able to then transform it into other things. Right. So let's see. Looking at things more exactly, however, the elements do not proceed directly from the materia prima, but from its first determination, ether, which fills all space equally, and which in alchemical writings is referred to as either a materia or as a quinta essentia, depending on whether it is viewed materially or qualitatively. And so again, that idea of the quintessence, the quinta essentia, the fifth essence. And then he goes on the next page to say, according to Hermetic tradition, the natural order of the elements is represented either by a cross, whose central point then corresponds with the quinta essentia, or by concentric circles, in which case earth is the middle point and fire is the outermost circle. So that second idea of four concentric circles, that very much follows, the geocentric and Aristotelian conception, of earth falling to the lowest point, water sitting on top of that, air rising, and then fire rising beyond that. It can be symbolized by four concentric circles that we saw earlier. But this other idea, though, here that about a cross whose central point then corresponds with the quintessence. I represented this as a cross in a circle because I think it'll be suggestive when we start looking at the lesser ritual of the pentagram. So how exactly the four arms get attributed to the elements could be done in a lot of different ways, but because we're talking about the lesser, the ritual of the pentagram here, I've given the elements here in the same. Like in the same order that the four quarters are given. You don't necessarily have to do it that way, but I think it's the most relevant for what we're doing here today. And this is, I think, a really interesting way of thinking about how we get from the 4 to the 5 and how that transformation happens, especially if you're thinking about kind of Kabbalah and like arithmology and about number, how the 4 is transformed into the 5. One way of thinking about it is as the formation of a cross, right? So the 4 arms of the cross imply a center point in the middle, and that is like the emergence of the fifth out of the four. I think that's a nice symbolic, mathematical, geometric way of thinking about this, that when we formulate this balanced, equal cross of the four elements, it naturally implies a center. And so when we look at the pentagram ritual, one thing you can keep in mind is when we'll see several different crosses, both the cross that appears like that is implied by the layout of the temple, as well as the cross that you will draw in your own body. We can think about that center point, whether that's like the center of the temple or like your own heart center as the place of the quintessence and of spirit. And then it'll even, in the second part of our workshop today, that will even become ritually relevant, that spirit is at the center. All right, so so let's look at, this is the tetragrammaton. A lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the tetragrammaton, Yod, He, Vav, He, remembering that Hebrew is read right to left. That's Yod, He, Vav, He. Now this is, coming from the Jewish tradition, the unpronounceable name of God. And we follow that tradition of not pronouncing it and of calling it either the tetragrammaton or of saying out the letters of Yod, He, Vav, He. And so the four letters of the tetragrammaton correspond with the four elements. So Yod corresponds with fire, the first He corresponds with water, Vav corresponds with air, and then the second He, or He final, corresponds with earth. And they also correspond to the four persons. Now, any of you who attended the past series that I did on the Sephiroth, we talked a lot about this idea. These are the parts of theme. And they're also related to the court cards in the tarot. So we're not going to get into any depth with that here. You can check out that class series if you're interested in learning more about that. But I'm just sort of refreshing you and drawing that connection here. And we're starting to bridge into Hebrew here and linking these traditional pagan Greek and alchemical ideas to the magical tradition and the Qabalistic tradition. And this will become relevant a little later, as you'll see. All right, and then we also have the idea of the archangels of the elements and the archangels of the quarters or the archangels of the directions. So again, same layout of the elements to the quarters, and now we're adding the four archangels here. If any of you have seen or attended the Paths, Letters, and Correspondences series, you'll recognize these as the four archangels that correspond to the paths attributed to these elements. So these are like Briatic powers. We're not going to really talk about the four worlds today, but these are the powers of the elements at the level of Bria. All right, so the archangel of, that's strange. How did that happen? Oh, okay, I guess we've got north there twice. For fire there at the top, that should say south, not north. I don't know how that got messed up there. But yeah, pretend that says south at the top there rather than north. Sorry about that. All the rest of them are correct. Okay, so the archangel of fire and the archangel of the south is Michael. The archangel of water and the archangel of the west is Gabriel. The archangel of air and the archangel of the east is Raphael. And the archangel of earth or the archangel of the north is Uriel. And so there you can see the spellings in Hebrew. The exact Hebrew or the exact English transliterations of that vary. You'll see different authors translating it into English in different ways. And I actually vary the way I do it too, not for any particular purpose, just because I've got multiple spellings in my head. So don't get confused by that. You'll see sometimes Michael won't have the H, or sometimes it'll be a C instead of a K. And Uriel is sometimes spelled A-U instead of just U there. But they're all the same names, just different ways of transliterating Hebrew. All right, and then we've got the archangels in the quarters there in our diagram, and we will use this in the ritual of the pentagram. All right, so we're going to talk a lot more about pentagram symbolism in the second half of the workshop today. But just one thing for now. This is from Agrippa from 3 Books of Occult Philosophy. This is a diagram, and then the accompanying text that he's got for this diagram. And so he's showed a series of diagrams of different ways of like mapping out and doing correspondences to the human body. But this is the one that's relevant here. So he says, but if on the same center a circle be made by the crown of the head, the arms being let fall so far till the end of the fingers touch the circumference of that circle, and the feet spread abroad in the same circumference, as much as the finger ends are distant from the top of the head, then they divide that circle, which was drawn from the center to the lower belly, into 5 equal parts, and do constitute a perfect pentagon. And the heels of the feet, having reference to the navel, make a triangle of equal sides. So he's talking about the geometry and the proportions of the body. And so this idea of the human body as the pentagram is extremely important. And as the 4 limbs and the head. Now his correspondences that he got here are planetary correspondences. So you see that he's got the sun at the solar plexus, the moon at the genitals, and then the other 5 planets are just arranged in order from the bottom left going clockwise around. So those planetary correspondences aren't particularly important. Now the pentagram itself has its roots back into prehistory and have all kinds of magical uses, all the way along, like way back into the Mesopotamian tradition. And I'm sure a number of different cultures all independently invent the pentagram. But it very often has, these magical uses and magical significance, and is one of the most central symbols of the magical tradition. Though it's used in different ways and understood in different ways at different times. But for now, the important point to get is that the pentagram, as a symbol of the human and of the human body, and also, of course, the 5 points naturally correspond to the 5 elements. So in the second part, we'll talk about which points correspond to which elements and why. But for now, the main thing to get is just that spirit is the top point, corresponding with the head and the crown of the head, and then the 4 limbs correspond to the 4 elements. And again, this is the idea of the quintessence, as over and above the 4 elements, and as the shape of the microcosm. So this is the microcosm both in the sense of like the individual human person, as well as the microcosm in the sense of like the elemental world that reflects the celestial world. So we got both of those ideas about microcosm and macrocosm represented by the pentagram. So there's a question here that says Briatic elements means archangels. Yeah, so the archangels are like the Briatic powers. The Atziluth, the highest of the 4 worlds, that's like the realm of divinity itself. And then the Briatic level is like the archangelic level. Then the Yetziratic level is the level of angels, intelligences, and spirits. And then the 4th or lowest world of Asaya is the realm of matter and of action. So it's not that the Briatic elements are the archangels, it's that the archangels are like the powers or persons or entities that correspond to the Briatic level. So you've got plenty of other archangels that correspond to other things besides the elements. I hope that makes sense. All right, so we've now got everything in place to talk about the lesser ritual of the pentagram and to learn the lesser ritual of the pentagram. So this will be the last thing we'll do before our break. We'll learn the lesser ritual of the pentagram, then we'll take a break for an hour and come back and talk about some more advanced things. Let's see, Stephen says, interesting to see the different placement of spirit at the top of the pentagram verse as the quintessence at the center of the cross. I've come to think about the sun as being a proxy for spirit anyway. It is definitely interesting to think about those 2 things. And, as I was sort of saying that, as the center of the cross, I like to think of as like the way that the 5th like emerges out of the 4, but then once the 5th has emerged, then it's the pentagram or something like that. So spirit as like the center of the cross is almost like the transition between the 4 and the 5, whereas the pentagram is what's formulated once we've like awakened to the reality of spirit and awakened to like the reality that of spirit that is within or beyond or behind or underlying all things. And when we are talking about, like especially early on in spiritual progress and in spiritual practice, is like finding the quintessence within the four. So symbolically, we could say that in the early stages of the path, we're only aware of the four. We're only aware of the four elements, and then by our own like inner alchemy, we extract that fifth essence from the four. And I would symbolize that as like the finding of the center of the cross, that you formulate the four arms in order to find the center. And then once you've found that center and identified that center, then you've transitioned over to the pentagram. Now spirit has taken its proper place as directing and governing and harmonizing and balancing the four elements. So yeah, and that's, I think, that's my own kind of take on it, and my own coming out of my own like meditations. But I think that's some powerful things that you can, that you can meditate on and think about those symbols. But yeah, great point. The sun as a proxy for spirit. Yeah, I mean that's definitely relevant and legitimate, though. Because of course the sun has its own correspondences, like in astrology and in astrological magic. It's not always exactly equivalent to spirit, but that sort of line of thinking is certainly relevant, and the sun certainly plays those kind of symbolic roles in certain contexts. All right, so lesser ritual of the pentagram. So the lesser ritual of the pentagram, or the LRP, is a ritual that manipulates generalized microcosmic force. So we can think of it as manipulating elemental force, but not a specific element of just a generalized elemental power or microcosmic power. And then later in the second half, when we look at the greater ritual of the pentagram, we'll be able to work with individual elements. But for now, this is just a general thing. And I'm emphasizing that point because, as will become clear later on, it's easy to think that the lesser ritual of the pentagram works with the element of earth, which it does not. As you'll see, that the particular forms of the pentagram that we're going to use are the same as the form, or sort of the same as the pentagrams for earth, and that's not a coincidence that it's the same as the pentagram forms for earth, but it's more about earth being the closest to like a generalized form of the elements, and the idea that earth like receives and consolidates the influence of the other three. So the earth pentagram is the most reasonable to use as a generalized symbol, but it's just important to be able to make that distinct and to be clear that in the lesser ritual of the pentagram, the force that we're invoking and the pentagram that we're using is just a generalized microcosmic force rather than a specific element. All right, so the lesser ritual of the pentagram comes in two forms or two flavors. We have the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, the LBRP, and then the lesser invoking ritual of the pentagram, the LIRP. Now the LBRP really gets all the press. I think people very frequently just talk about the LBRP, or I learned the LBRP, and seem to give kind of secondary importance to the LIRP. And in one sense, this isn't completely off base. Definitely in the early stages, if you're new to pentagram rituals and new to ceremonial magic, you definitely want to learn to banish first. It's much more important to be able to clear things out than to bring things in. Some people, especially people I think who tend to be kind of naturally psychic or naturally sensitive, may find that it's a lot easier to bring things in than to clear things out. So you definitely want to have the ability to sort of reset and to rebalance before you start bringing stuff in. That won't be universal, but that's something that some of you may experience or may have experienced. Another thing too is that I think the LBRP has a more like hygienic sort of function. The LBRP helps to sort of balance and center, and it's kind of like it's like the magical equivalent of taking a shower, right? That it's cleansing and balancing, and it is important for maintenance. Whereas the LIRP tends to be invigorating and energizing, and it's important for for magical progress, for training the ability to bring in force and to manipulate force and experiencing force. So ultimately, they're of equal importance, but the LBRP should probably come first. Though definitely, I think people who have worked only with the LBRP and not the LIRP may end up coming to the conclusion that the lesser ritual of the pentagram doesn't do a whole lot or isn't that effective. But I think once you switch to the LIRP, you'll get much more prominent and obvious effects, especially if you've done the preliminary work of balancing and purifying. That is, of course, really important and foundational. But once you've done that, then making the transition over to the invoking form really takes things up to a whole other level and can be much more striking and much more profound to invoke. If you're brand new, you might want to do LBRP alone for maybe a month or so. If you're doing it every day, a month is probably plenty. If you're doing it a little less often, maybe a month or two. And then you can start adding in the lesser invoking ritual, the pentagram, once you've done that. And definitely for training purposes, I would recommend working with the LBRP. But just be aware that the LBRP tends to give less dramatic results than the LIRP, which is both good and bad, right? So Maria says that she's done lots of LBRP and never felt any effect. And so you may switching to the LIRP may change that. I know a number of people that have had that experience. Of course, different things work better for different people. So some rituals may just be more or less efficacious for you, but I would definitely recommend working with the LIRP and seeing if your results are any different. All right, so the basic structure of the lesser ritual of the pentagram is very simple. It's just 4 parts, and the first and fourth part are the same. So we've got what's called the Qabalistic cross as a bookend that both begins and ends the ritual. The purpose of the Qabalistic cross is both to connect us to a higher source of power, it's kind of like plugging things in and turning things on and getting us ready for ritual, as well as balancing and sort of harmonizing our own state before going on to do other work. Oh yeah, let's see. Pagam noting that David and Shoemaker and many other magicians as well have suggested LIRP in the morning and the banishing in the evening. Thanks for reminding me of that. Some people, and I'm definitely included in this, find it very difficult to sleep within even 4 or 5 hours of doing the lesser invoking ritual of the pentagram. So that's something that you may be aware of. Some people experience that more than others. I've always had sort of trouble sleeping and trouble with insomnia, so I'm very sensitive to that effect. Definitely like intensive ritual and invoking can definitely like prevent my sleep. So doing it in the morning is great. And it also, I think it just makes sense with like the rhythm of the day. When you're getting started and beginning the day, you want to sort of energize yourself and turn things on and get things moving. And then before sleep, it's about, sort of closing things back down and kind of balancing, returning to a baseline state before sleeping. So yeah, that's a great suggestion. But it's interesting to do some experiments as well and to see what works best for you and for your life. And for specific magical purposes, you may want to vary that. So it's not like an absolute rule or anything like that. All right, so the Qabalistic cross, we're going to bookend our ritual with the Qabalistic cross. And then the core of the ritual really has just 2 major parts. We're going to establish the circle, the ritual space, and we're going to draw pentagrams and intone divine names in each of the 4 quarters. And then after doing that, we're going to return to the center of our ritual space and invoke the 4 archangels into the quarters. So pretty simple. Now, before going through a more detailed walkthrough of this, I'm going to show you a video of myself performing this ritual. So let's hope this works. It worked last night. Hopefully it'll work now. One of the funny things is that the sound of the video won't come through, so I'm going to vibrate the names now live along with the video of myself. So let's hope this works. I'm going to shut off my video, both for buffering purposes and because I don't think there's any need to look at 2 of me at once. All right, let's see. All right, so you should be seeing a video of me. And here we go. Until I was more cool, big Amen. Yorivavi. Adonai. Yeah. Atagibol Elam Adonai. For me, Raphael. Find me, Gabriel. On my right hand, Miguel. On my left hand, Oriel. For about me flames the pentagram, in the column shines the six-rayed star. Ada, I was Mongol, Begimura, Begidula, Leolam, Amen. All right. So let's turn my video back on here. I get so close to cracking up, Malcolm. Damn it, but that is very funny. All right. So that was fun. All right, so let's see. We might go just a couple minutes over noon here. Oh, let's see. Before jumping in, Stephen says, can you say something about the dagger? I've got one in the air spot on my altar, but seem to remember reading that a different one should be used for the pentagram rituals. I may be imagining this. Right, so actually we'll talk a little bit about the elemental weapons in the second part. There is a difference between a banishing dagger and an air dagger. So the air dagger is very specifically like the elemental weapon of earth, the elemental weapon of air. And that's only used for both banishing and invoking the element of air. Just like a fire wand is used to work with fire, a cup is used to work with water. So yeah, you'd want to have a different dagger. If you have a specific air dagger, you'd want to have a separate one for banishing or for like a general purposes. Yeah. again, the air dagger would normally be like painted yellow and would have like divine names of in the Golden Dawn tradition, and would have like divine names of air painted on it. Yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the second half of the class. Okay, so now that you've seen me do it, hopefully that'll give you a helpful, you've seen it once, and now we can talk through it in some more detail. All right, so following these 4 stages here, computer's trying to get me to install updates. Leave me alone. All right, so the Qabalistic cross here is the first stage, and it will again be the fourth and final stage as well. Let's see, someone's asking if the wand is the same as the Athane, basically. We can substitute a wand for that. You know, I'm not really familiar. I know that comes from kind of the Wiccan and neo-pagan traditions. I'm honestly not sure how they use that, so I can't really speak to the equivalence. For the purposes of this ritual, you can use a dagger. You can use like a general wand that you have, or you can work empty-handed as well. All of those are perfectly fine. If you're working empty-handed, a lot of people just use like just an index finger, right? So you just like draw the pentagrams in the air with just the index finger. That's pretty common. Although some of you may be familiar with who Damien Eccles is. Yeah, a really sort of powerful story. He was falsely accused of murder and on death row for many years, and really like survived and sustained himself by practicing ceremonial magic while in prison. But he's been freed and has written a few books on magic. And in his book, I think that was High Magic. Yeah, he's got a few. I think in his book High Magic, he suggests that using like a single index finger is like the empty-handed equivalent of a wand, and 2 index fingers he calls it like the dagger mudra. So that's actually an idea that I've been using that I got from him. So if I'm working empty-handed, I'll use 2 fingers together as an equivalent to a dagger, and then 1 finger by itself as an equivalent to the wand. You know, that's not like an official part of our tradition, but I like being able to make that differentiation. So you can try that out if you want. Oh yeah, he has an episode of the Midnight Gospel on Netflix. Yep. Yeah, he's a really, I mean, again, really powerful story. But he also has a lot of interesting things to say on magic that are just valuable in their own right. Yeah. Yeah, and his last name, that Eccles, is Echols, if anyone wants to look into him. But yeah, very influenced by the Golden Dawn and Flemish tradition. Anyways, so the Qabalistic cross here. So you're facing east. In that video, the facing towards the camera was facing east. So facing east, you have the dagger or the wand. It begins in your non-dominant hand. Right, so that's the left hand for right-handed people and right hand for left-handed people. Some left-handed people still do it the same way that right-handed people do. That's totally your preference, though you're welcome to use your dominant hand if that's better for you. All right, so dagger wand in your non-dominant hand, if you're using one. You'll touch the forehead. I like to kind of start with my hand a little bit above my forehead and come down, like it's a nice sense of drawing power down, but that's just an optional thing. You'll intone ata, which means like unto or unto thee. Touch the heart center and intone iwas. Now, this is something that's not part of the original version of this ritual, but was added by Crowley, and he taught this especially to his students in California later in life, and that's been carried on by his students like Jane Wolfe and Phyllis Seckler. You know, if you want to just do a classic Golden Dawn version of it, you can leave that out. And Iwas here is being used not so much as Crowley's like personal holy guardian angel, but as the fountain and source of the Thelemic tradition. And the idea would be that eventually, if you receive a name from your holy guardian angel, you could use that instead. But it's a generic because it is that entity is the source of the Thelemic current. All right, and then touch the genital centers and intone Malkuth, the kingdom. Touch the right shoulder and intone Vegavura, the power. Touch the left shoulder and intone Vegadula. Clasp your hands on your breast and intone Leolam, Amen, like unto the ages, Amen. So this whole sequence the I was doesn't quite fit in grammatically, but it's Ata, Malkuth, Vegavura, Vegadula, Leolam, Amen, is like unto thee the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. And while you're doing this, you're visualizing a cross of white light extending from just above your head, and then you're bringing it down to your forehead, down to your heart, and then down to your genital center, and then through that all the way to your floor, into your feet and into the floor. And then as you make the cross from shoulder to shoulder, you're drawing a horizontal bar across it, which formulates that center at the heart center. And that's where you're clasping your hands on your breast. I kind of interlock my finger. There's no necessarily one right way to do it, but this is how we teach it. Clasping my hands on the breast. And then if you're using an implement, the implement is like in the middle of your fingers, which can be a little awkward, but if you practice it, you'll get the hang of it. All right. And then now you're going to go around the circle and drawing the pentagrams. If you're in a small ritual space, you don't have to step forward at all. You can just rotate in place, though you can also kind of step forward and then make like a circle around your ritual space, depending on how much room you have and what you're doing. All right, so you'll now move your implement to the dominant hand. And then, now move to the east or just face east. And now you'll trace your pentagram. And now here is where the difference between the invoking and banishing forms comes in. For the invoking form, you're starting at the top point and moving down to the lower left, and then continuing all the way around the pentagram until you get back to the top point. And for the banishing form, you're starting at the bottom left and moving up to the top point, and then continuing all the way around until you get back to the bottom left. So obviously that was the banishing form that I was doing in the video. And in the east, you're intoning the divine name Yod He Vav He. And the idea with intoning here is that some people also call it vibrating. It's a magical technique and a special way of using the voice. I wasn't doing it as loud as I normally would here because I didn't want to like kind of overblow the speakers, over my microphone here. But it should be. It doesn't need to. You don't need to shout it, but it should be a resonant and like a projective tone that gives the feeling of like vibration in the body. And so you can really experiment with how you do this. Whether it's a high or a low tone and how exactly it works. I like to kind of nasalize it somewhat. It helps to give that feeling of a total body vibration. But that's a great thing to experiment with, and you'll hear different magicians do it in lots of different ways. So in the east, we're using the divine name Yod He Vav He. All right, and then after you've drawn your pentagram, and we're visualizing these pentagrams in blue, white light, you then, so you draw the pentagram, point the implement to the center of the pentagram, and then I like to take a short step forward and lean a little bit to emphasize that forward motion, but that's up to you. That's an optional thing. All right, and then, so you draw your pentagram, you vibrate your divine name, and now you, keeping your implement in the air or your finger, you trace like a quarter of the arc of the circle around to the south, which is either moving around to the south of your temple or just rotating 90 degrees in place. Now you're tracing another pentagram in the south and vibrating the divine name Adonai, which means Lord in Hebrew, and is a kind of beautiful name for the holy guardian angel. Same thing, you'll trace either the invoking or banishing form of your pentagram, point the implement to the center, and intone Adonai. And then do the same again, trace the next quarter of the circle arc around to the west, and intone the divine name Eheye, which means something like I am, and is an important divine name connected with Kether. And then again, trace another quarter of the arc to the north. And now, in most texts, this is given as Agla, Aleph, Gimel, Lamed, Aleph. We teach, now this is what's called an Antarikon, an abbreviation. Some people just vibrate the word Agla, but the tradition that's come down to us is that this was always an abbreviation, and that in practice, students were always taught to vibrate the full phrase, which is Ata Gibor Leolam Adonai, which is like to thee the power forever, O Lord, would be a rough translation of that. Let's see, Mari's saying, I am that I am, right? That's Eheye Esher Eheye, I am that I am. Just Eheye by itself is I am, right? But that's exactly why that word is such a powerful divine name, is because of that phrase. Right, so that's your fourth divine name in the north. And then make sure to complete your circle, trace that last quarter of the arc back to the east, completing your circle and ending where you began. So the pentagrams are visualized in a kind of blue-white light, and this will also help to differentiate it from the earth pentagram, as we'll see later, which you'll visualize in a completely different color. So you trace these fairly large, about the size from like head down to like lower torso is the approximate size. I recommend keeping your arms, like your elbow, not locked out, but straight, and then just moving from the shoulder is a good way to do it. Because the shoulder's not in the center of your body, it won't be geometrically perfect, but it's good enough and probably more accurate than any other way of doing it. And so the points of the pentagram sort of roughly align with the crown of the head, the shoulders, and the hips. If you're using an implement, I put my hand at those places, and so the implement will extend out further. But that's a good approximation for starting to work with it. There's no need to obsess about like geometric perfection of the pentagram, but try for accuracy if you can. And be under control. I see some people kind of like really like flailing their arms around in a kind of exaggerated way. I prefer something a little more controlled and a little more precise. But you can experiment with what works for you. All right, and then you return to the center of your circle, still facing east, and now extend your arms out in the form of a cross, and you'll say, "Before me, Raphael, behind me, Gabriel, on my right hand, Michael, on my left hand, Uriel, for about me flames the pentagram, and in the column shines the six-rayed star." And the actual names of the archangels, you want to vibrate those and to intone those, though the rest of the words can be said in a normal but maybe dramatic and sort of projective voice. And I've also got here some details on the basic visualizations for the four archangels. So in the south, the archangel Michael wears a red robe with green trim, which is the color of fire, and the complementary color of green on top of it. And he bears a wand, and this is the elemental weapon of fire. Gabriel wears a blue robe with orange trim, so this is the color of water with the complementary color, and he's bearing a cup, the implement of water. In the east, Raphael has a yellow robe with violet trim, the color of air and its complement, and he bears a sword or a dagger, the implement of air. And then in the north, Uriel wears a black robe with white trim, and he bears a disc, or pentacle, the elemental implement of earth. Yeah, and so this is just sort of really basic, simple visualizations. Over time, you can elaborate on this, as you feel inspired to do, and especially as you start to get more results and start to really have the sense of these archangels actually being like beings or presences within the room. You can start to maybe like relax your own visualization and let things sort of come to you, and so this can kind of develop and evolve over time, but this is a great, you want to start with something accurate and precise to begin with. The visualizations built from the letters, yeah, that's an interesting Golden Dawn technique. That's not how we usually teach that, although it is an interesting variation. Because we're so focused on the elements here, I think this probably makes more sense, though that's certainly something that you could experiment with, as a variation or as a more advanced practice. Yeah, but I think starting here makes more sense because this is so focused on the elements, whereas a lot of those letters are going to have like planetary correspondences and zodiacal correspondences and other associations that aren't specifically elemental. But yeah, again, there's no necessarily right or wrong answer there. All right, and then finally, you just come back to this, you come back still in the center, facing east, you just repeat the Kabbalistic cross exactly as you did at the beginning. And that's it. That's the lesser ritual of the pentagram. So pretty simple, but there's a lot of room for depth and is very profound. So all right, we're a few minutes over, so we'll break here. Let's see, we went 10 minutes over. Just coming back at 1 sound okay? 1 p.m. Pacific. That'll just be a 50-minute break rather than an hour. Does that sound okay to people? Actually, I'm shut off the recording in a moment. If you're watching this on YouTube, by the time this goes up, the second part of this should be up already. So just take a look on our channel for that. Thanks for watching.